Dear learners, I am Christina Georgy. I welcome you to my session on literary criticism and theory. Before we move further, let me clarify that this is a specialized session specifically designed for the MEG learners. Hence, all the aspects discussed here will be solely based on or limited to the prescribed syllabus and study material for MEG-05, the course code which is titled Literary Criticism and Theory. So, in our previous sessions, we were discussing the Western critical thoughts. We dealt with an introduction to all those Western literary criticisms and thoughts such as that of Plato, Aristotle. Thereafter we moved on to Romanticism, and as part of the initial few units 2 and 3 respectively of block 1, we had an overview of the important aspects such as new criticism. Then we looked into Marx and Marxism. We also had a brief understanding of feminism, feminist theory. We also looked into Foucault and his notions of sexuality, among many other aspects. So today I would like to focus your attention towards a contemporary literary theory. So now comes the question, what do you mean by contemporary literary theory? So in our previous sessions we looked at the past, all the criticisms and theories over the years. But now today's session will focus on a very recent development, comparatively recent development. Mostly they have this post prefix attached to them. In our other session we discussed what is meant by post. What do you mean by post? P-O-S-T. When it comes as a prefix. What do you mean by a prefix? Yes, correct. That is the right answer. Prefix and suffix. You must have studied affixes, MEG-04 aspects of language. Affixes include prefixes and suffixes. Prefixes means something that comes before the root form of the verb. For example, unbelievable. So believable would be the root form of the verb, and un would be the prefix. Un plus believable gives you unbelievable. Likewise, let's take the case of kindness. K-I-N-D, kind, plus N-E-S-S, ness. Okay. So this kind would be the root form of the verb, and N-E-S-S would be the suffix. Alright. So an affix that comes before the root form of the word would be a prefix, whereas an affix that comes after the root form of the verb would be termed as a suffix. So here in the term postmodernism, post would be a prefix. Alright. So all those theories, most of those theories that we study as part of the contemporary literary theories have this prefix, this particular prefix post. Say postmodernism, postcolonialism, etc. So today we will focus our attention towards yet another contemporary literary theory titled postcolonialism. So this falls under unit 4 of block 8 of your official study material. So if you look at unit 4, it is titled Postcolonial Theory, Sayre, Spivak and Bauer. So if you are wondering what these aspects are after the semicolon, it's basically the subtitle of this particular chapter. These are names of important figures, basically critics in the field of postcolonialism. I would say these are important figures, literary figures in the field of postcolonialism. Is that clear so far? So we will start off with postcolonialism because this is something relatable. Every single person here would be aware of postcolonialism. In simple terms, postcolonialism means after colonialism. I don't have to give you a detailed lecture on colonialism. I'm very sure that every single person present here would certainly have an idea regarding colonialism. After the impact of the colonial empire, there happened a few literary outputs. People began to use their language. Which is the language mentioned here? The language of the colonizer. What is the language in discussion? Yes, correct. They made use of their language in order to write back. In essence, these colonized nations and people began to make their own literary outputs. So all these literary outputs are generally classified as post-colonial literature. We will come to that. Before discussing the textual aspect, I think it would be of great help to you if I give you a general overview on post-colonialism as such before moving on to the theory as such. Alright. So I would actually discuss a few points. This wouldn't be there in your textbook. You don't have to study all this, but a general understanding of this would certainly help you prepare effectively. Alright. Yes. So the term post-colonialism refers to the historical period representing the aftermath of Western colonialism. That is, after the colonizers have left, what happened? Okay, that is post-colonialism. For example, in the Indian context, it refers to the study of the period after the British rule in India. We know the Indian scenario. Once we got independence, the Britishers left India. So what happened after that? Okay, the study would be termed as a post-colonial study. Hence, it is a study of the consequences of colonialism that the native people felt. Who are the natives? People who originally belong to that particular country. In the Indian context, we would be the natives, that is, our forefathers would be the natives, and the Britishers are the colonizers mentioned. Alright, so I told you it is a study of the consequences of colonialism that the natives felt, such as overt control, exploitation, loss of properties, human rights, etc. That is, as a consequence of the British rule, the natives in India suffered from overt control, means too much of control and restriction, exploitation, that is utilization of resources and manpower, loss of their own properties, and many such aspects. So, you being a student of the master's degree in English language and literature must certainly be familiar to post-colonial literatures in English. I suppose you have studied at least a few of them. Have you ever read or studied any post-colonial literature as such as part of your syllabus? I know you are first year students. Nevertheless, as part of drama or novel, have you studied any work that mentions colonialism? You can say no if you are not sure. Okay, so I'll give you a few examples. Yeah, so listen to me. Don't worry if you are not able to follow at the moment. You can listen to this later. So this term post-colonial literature refers to, yes, Amina, that is a perfect answer. Heart of Darkness. Do you know who has written that particular work? Yes, wonderful. That is correct. Okay, study that. I think your text also mentions this work. It is important with respect to post-colonial studies. And a quick mention regarding title writing. Make sure that you write titles properly. When you mention a work's title, you need to capitalize the main words. I think I've told you this in our previous sessions. Please make sure. I understand when you text during the sessions, you text with ease. Right, but for your examination, make sure that you write the proper title with proper punctuations and capitalizations. Alright, so moving on, this term post-colonial literature refers to the literature produced by the people who were formerly colonized and subjugated. So this term, colonized and subjugated, are important. These terms, colonized and subjugated, are key terms with respect to your TEE. For that matter, you need to have an idea regarding the differences between the colonizer and the colonized. Who is the colonizer? I'll give you options. The Britishers or Indians. I'm referring to the Indian context. Colonizer. Colonizer, British. Colonized, Indians. Alright? With respect to the Indian context. Similarly, the situation prolonged or this happened in other parts of the world too. For our ease of understanding, we are referring to the Indian context. So always remember these two key terms, colonizer and colonized, whenever you refer to post-colonial theory. If you are lucky, you'll get an essay this time. And I want to make sure that everybody attempts that essay. Alright? If there comes a question, you are very lucky. So if that question comes, make sure that you mention all the key terms. This colonizer and colonized, very often we see students being confused and they write the reverse. Alright? They might know the concept, but when they put it into writing, they make mistakes. That is why I'm discussing this in class with this much importance ascribed to it. That is, colonizer would be the party who subjugates another, maybe community. In the Indian context, the colonizer is certainly the Britishers who overpowered, or rather who tried to rule over the natives of India. Whereas the colonized refers to the people who faced subjugation, marginalization and all other related aspects. So subjugation would be also a very relatable key term. So post-colonial literature refers to the body of work by the colonized people to annihilate the influences exerted by the colonizers in their life. I repeat, post-colonial literature refers to the body of work written by whom? The colonized people. What was the purpose? To annihilate the influences exerted by whom? The colonizers in their day-to-day lives during those times. So I used a word, annihilate. Have you heard this word before? See, this word is written with this spelling, A-N-I-H-I-L-A-T-E. So normally people tend to pronounce this word as annihilate. Okay. So if I had said annihilate, maybe some of you could have understood. But trust me when I say this, the right pronunciation is annihilate. Okay. Annihilate. Just the way people say elite, it's actually elite. Okay. Likewise, that H is silent here and we pronounce this word as annihilate. Alright. It means destroy. Yeah. Destroy utterly maybe. That is total destruction kind of a meaning is ascribed to this word. Alright. Is that clear? Yeah. As far as you are concerned, you don't have to worry regarding the pronunciation because you don't have an oral examination. Nevertheless, as you are studying literature, it is always better if you could have a right understanding of pronunciation. For that matter, next year, please make sure that you study MEG-04 thoroughly. So now, let's have a look at some examples for post-colonial literatures. So, make sure that you study a few examples. I think a few of them are mentioned in your study material. Don't you worry, we'll move on to the study material line by line. Before that, I would like to give you an overview. That's what I'm doing at the moment. As part of the overview, I'll give you a few examples, famous examples. If interested, you may jot down and refer to the audio later. Firstly, just like you said, Heart of Darkness. That is a quintessential post-colonial literature. It is written by Joseph Conrad. When you write an author's name, it is a suggestion. It is not a rule because I want you to pass. If you want to pass, you need to make sure that if you are mentioning Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, it would be great if you could mention that he is a Polish British novelist. So how do you bring that into your writing? When you write, you can write that a quintessential example of a post-colonial work is Heart of Darkness by the Polish-British novelist Joseph Conrad. See how all the key words were put into a single sentence? Do you follow me? So moving on to the very next example, you must have heard, yes, thank you so much, I appreciate that. You must have heard about Chinua Achebe. Chinua Achebe is a Nigerian novelist. I've seen people writing he is an African author or something. But make sure that you mention in particular that he is a Nigerian novelist. Chinua Achebe's novel as part of their BA course. And Things Fall Apart. I'm not very sure whether you have studied this. Have you studied Things Fall Apart? It's a very interesting novel. Yes, you have studied. Good. So then you know. So never forget this work, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Alright. The next example would be Orientalism by Edward Said. Okay. Regarding this particular writer, we'll deal with him in detail once we move on to the study material as such. I'll give you line by line explanation. I really wish a question comes from post-colonial literature because it would fetch you marks. It's not very tough when compared to certain other theories that you might struggle with. Alright? Remember this work, Orientalism by Edward Said, and he was a Palestinian American novelist. Not just a novelist, you can write a writer, because regarding Said we'll have a detailed overview. And there is this American British novelist whose work is titled Midnight's Children. Do you know this particular author? Anybody? Yes, Salman Rushdie. Okay, I said American British writer. Okay, did you know that he also has relation to India? He has his roots in India. Did you know that? Yeah, you must have studied this, right? Yeah, I was cross-checking whether it's The Midnight's Children or Midnight's Children, because I've also seen people writing The Midnight's Children. Actually, the correct title is Midnight's Children. Okay? Yeah, I said the correct title, but when you write, make sure that you don't write the unnecessarily. Okay? Yeah. Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie is also a very popular work of art in relation to post-colonial studies. So in short, after referring to all these examples, we could say that post-colonial literatures often addresses the problems and consequences of the decolonization of a country, especially questions related to the political and cultural independence of formerly subjugated people and themes such as racism and colonialism. Okay, so there was this word decolonization. I suppose you are aware of it. Okay, that is also a key term. Then themes such as racism and colonialism. So make sure that you know all these key terms. Now let's focus our attention towards the textual details. Let me remind you that whatever we are about to discuss falls under Unit 4 of Block 8 of your official study material. There you could see that here, even though post-colonial theory is a vast area, we'll limit our discussion towards three of the seminal figures, namely Edward Said, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak and Homi K. Bhabha. Alright? Within the wide range of concepts put forth by all these figures, we'll limit our study towards the concept of Orientalism put forth by Edward Said, subalternity put forth by Gayatri Spivak, and mimicry put forth by Homi Bhabha. So these three major critics are often taken to be the holy trinity of postcolonial theory. So from this particular unit, you need to be thorough with these three names. Which are the three names? Edward Said, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak and Bhumike Bhava. Even if you forget the first names, make sure that you study, or rather you remember the second names. Which are the second names? Seth, Spivak and Bhava. Alright? And three of their concepts, that is one each. Orientalism by Edward Said, subalternity by Spivak and mimicry by Bhava. So have you ever studied any of these before? If not, I need to give you an overview. Okay. So we heard that these three figures or critics, because we are dealing with criticism and theory, so you could straight away call them critics. In my other lecture, I think, when we discussed the previous question papers of MEG-01, I told you that never mention the person who has written a piece of poem as writer or author, because there in that particular paper we are solely dealing with poetry. So you should address the said writer as a poet only. Here in the case of literary criticism, instead of mentioning author or writer, you can mention critic, because one who criticizes a work of art would certainly be called a critic. So in case of MEG-1, the key term is poet. In case of MEG-5, the key term is critic. Am I making sense to you? Alright. So these three figures, that is Seth, Spivak and Bhava, are the three major critics, and they are often called as the holy trinity of postcolonial theory. What do you mean by holy trinity of postcolonial theory? In order to comprehend that, you need to have clarity regarding this concept of holy trinity. Have you ever heard of this concept before? It is a religious concept. It is associated with one particular religion. Do you know which religion? Of course, Christianity, because when we study literature, especially the Western canon, the Western literary canon has lot of references with respect to Christianity. Even when we studied MEG-1, because this paper doesn't deal with a lot of literary works as such. Okay, so hence I'm taking the example of MEG-1. There we looked into many poets, and most of them have these Christian religious influences in their writings, and they make use of allegory and allusions from the Holy Bible. Similarly, this concept of Holy Trinity, I suppose at least a few of you are aware of. I'll explain that in case of people who are not familiar with this concept. That is, it refers to the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. That is, there is this belief that there is one God who is the Father, Son and Holy Spirit. Trinity refers to the number 3, a combination of Father, Son and Holy Spirit. Basically a trio in general parlance. Okay? It is actually a biblical allusion, that is use of words related to the Bible. Holy Trinity. So here this biblical allusion is used in order to refer to 3 seminal figures, or rather 3 important critics in the field of post-colonial theory. Who are the holy trinity of post-colonial theory? It's none other than Seth, Spivak and Bhava. So even if I mention this quite a few times repeatedly, I'm very sure at least some of you would forget the names. For that matter, please make sure that you remember these 3 people, these 3 critics and their key concepts. Alright. Moving on to the next section, 4.1 as such. It is mentioned in your study material that earlier we discussed Foucault, Derrida, Lacan, and all these were French thinkers, and we discussed their contributions. Foucault we discussed in terms of gender, sexuality, Derrida in terms of deconstruction, Lacan is related to psychoanalysis, all these aspects you understood so far. And now, in case of post-colonial theory, the one major figure, the man who has exercised the greatest influence is Foucault. That is, among all these French thinkers, the one person who influenced post-colonial theory would be undoubtedly Foucault. Note the spelling of Foucault. Said's works show his influence. Whose influence? Foucault's influence in a very marked way. Hence, we could say that Edward Said was influenced by Foucault and his works. Meanwhile, to some extent, even the other two in the Holy Trinity. With respect to postcolonialism, you need to mention that too. Spivak and Bava were also influenced by Foucault slightly. Alright. Nevertheless, the major influence of Spivak was Derrida, whereas the major influence of Bava was Lacan. So if you are wondering what I am just mentioning, this falls under the first paragraph of your section 4.1. So I was speaking about Foucault's influence on Said. And who was Spivak's influence? It was Derrida. Whereas Bava was influenced by Lacan. So with respect to the Holy Trinity of post-colonial theory, all these three critics had important influences from French thinkers. With respect to Edward Said, the major influence was Foucault. The other two were also influenced by Foucault. Nevertheless, with respect to Spivak, the major influence was Derrida, and in case of Bava, the main influence was Lacan. So for your ease of studying, within your textbook, you could make slide notes. It's up to you. You are all adults. I don't have to prescribe such thoughts into your minds. Nevertheless, I find it as if my responsibility to help you. So when you write, I appreciate that you're doing so. You can write set and hyphen Foucault, Spivak hyphen Derrida, Bava hyphen Lacan. To be very honest, this is how I do. Even while delivering the lectures, it would be very difficult if I go line by line reading. Now I could, actually help you out effectively just because I have also made my own notes. If you look into my study material, I have prepared, I attached white papers as and between pages and have written all those relevant stuff so that I could substantiate my lectures with sufficient details. This is exactly what you should also do. You need to mention all the keywords appropriately. At times, you need to make your own reordering of points. Even if you don't do so, make sure that you mention all the key points. With respect to this particular paper, it's all about points because we don't have any stories or any pieces of poetry for that matter in order to write summary and to finish pages. Alright, here it's all up to the key points. We'll see if we could discuss the important questions towards the end, or maybe we'll see how it goes. Alright, yes, that would be the main aspect from that particular page. Now moving on to the next page, page number 24, you need to know that post-colonialism involves a studied engagement with the experience of colonialism and its present effects both at the level of ex-colonial societies and of more general global developments thought to be the after effects of empire. See, this is simply what I mentioned during the introductory paragraph that I narrated to you. Rather, during the initial few minutes of this particular lecture, I told you what post-colonialism is. This is exactly what I meant. Here it is written in flowery language, that's all the difference. Post-colonialism, it involves a studied engagement, that is, it involves the experience of colonialism. How the colonizers and the colonized had this relationship of give and take, or rather subjugation, how it was experienced by the natives and its present effects, how this colonialism has affected the people of that particular nation and its effects even today could all be studied as part of postcolonialism. So what was it that gave rise to postcolonialism? There is this question mentioned in your study material. They've given the reasons to: first, independence movements around the world put an end to colonialism. We know the case with India. Right, so I don't have to mention that in detail. I suppose when you take up Indian literature as part of your second year, you'll study this in detail. Okay. First, independence movements around the world put an end to colonialism, yet the residual effects of imperialism continue to affect the cultures of the erstwhile colonies. Okay, just remember that The Wretched of the Earth, published in the year 1961. That particular work you should never forget. Frantz Fanon, we'll discuss him in detail later. Just know that he is a critic, and his work titled The Wretched of the Earth, published in 1961, is one such intervention in colonial discourse. And what happened towards the end of 1980s? A substantial body of Commonwealth literature had emerged in which writers tried to make sense of the impact of colonialism. Here we are referring to the post-colonial literatures as such. That is, by the 1980s, there emerged the post-colonial literatures. When you put that into words, make sure that you write the key terms also. By the 1980s, a substantial body of Commonwealth literature had emerged in which writers try to make sense of the impact of colonialism. That is, all those colonized nations, there emerged write-ups from these nations, and there evolved post-colonial theory as well. Okay, we'll discuss post-colonial theory too. That is, this refers to a body of thought primarily concerned with the political, economic, social, historical and aesthetic impact of the colonial rule around the world in the 18th century through the 20th century. For example, you mentioned that you've studied Things Fall Apart. Okay, there you could see the influence of English education, the influence of Christianity, and how those tribes, Yoruba tribes, if I remember right, how those natives also changed gradually because of the influence of colonialism. That work you have already studied, so I suppose you get an idea. This is what exactly we do. In that particular work, when you must have written the answers, you were expected to read that particular work from a post-colonial lens. I'm very sure then you must not have been thoroughly familiar with post-colonial theory, but now you are very much familiar, so you can actually write a critical appreciation on that work at this moment with a post-colonial lens in mind. So I repeat, post-colonial theory is a body of thought primarily concerned with the political, economic, social, historical and aesthetic impact of the colonial rule around the world, not just in India or anywhere else, around the world. Hence we term it as Commonwealth literatures in 18th century through the 20th century. Now, the major theoretical works in post-colonial theory. Never ever forget the work that we have already seen, Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, published in 1961. My strong suggestion is to study these years, but it is not a rule. If you write the year correctly, you'll score more. If you are not thoroughly familiar with the year, try not to write the wrong year, because whoever is evaluating would certainly be familiar with the year, because every person who has expertise in literary theory would certainly know these years by heart. Alright? Yes. Now comes, see, if I ask you the poetry definition put forth by Wordsworth. Yeah. If I ask you regarding the definition of poetry put forth by Wordsworth, I'm quite sure that most of my MEG-1 learners would be able to answer. Likewise, in case of somebody who has expertise in the field of literary theory, would certainly be familiar with the dates. So it's a suggestion from my part not to write the wrong dates. That's far way better than writing the wrong date. Even if you don't mention, that's much better. Yeah. So, Fan's Wretched of the Earth, published in 1961. The second work would be Orientalism, published in 1978 by Edward Said. In Other Worlds, 1987 publication by Spivak. Nation and Narration, 1990 by Homi Bhabha. Don't you worry, it's mentioned in the textbook at some parts. We'll come to that when we discuss line by line. If you look into your study material, the section 4.2 deals with the Holy Trinity. In the sense, this section would elaborate upon the life and works of the three major critics with respect to our study on postcolonialism. Firstly, Edward Said. So he was a Palestinian American professor of literature at Columbia University. I suppose this is not mentioned in your study material. It's always better if you know at least a one-line detail regarding the person or the critic that you're studying. So I repeat, Edward Said was a Palestinian American professor of literature at Columbia University. He was a public intellectual and also the founder of the academic field of post-colonial studies. He was the one who actually initiated a field of study called post-colonial studies. And at that time, he did a lot of research on post-colonial literatures too. So he is not alive at the moment. He passed away in the year 2003. I'll just help you out with the most important aspects. That is, Said's book. Which book are we referring to? Orientalism. This book establishes that stereotypes and general ideology about the Orient as the other. We need discussion on this. That is, what do you mean by stereotyping? Stereotyping. Make sure that you refer to Block 6 Feminist Theories. Anybody interested would also listen to my lecture. Stereotyping, I have elaborated there in my lecture. Stereotyping refers to the way we ascribe certain ways of behavior to some maybe people or entities. Yes, it's kind of a generalization. There is the stereotype among kids that young boys prefer blue, they play with cars and maybe Marvel toys in case of new gen kids. And when it is a girl, exactly, girls prefer pink, they play with Barbies and they play with all these soft toys. That is the way things are stereotyped. With respect to post-colonialism, the stereotype intended is that the colonizer is the supreme authority and the colonized must be subjugated. Interestingly, the colonizer considered it as if their responsibility in order to civilize the colonized people. You must have studied this at some point in time. So, let me read this again. What Said tried to put in this book is that he establishes that stereotypes and general ideology about the Orient as the other. What do you mean by Orient? You must have heard of these terms Oriental and Occidental. Do you know the basic difference between these two terms? Just like how I distinguish between the colonizer and the colonized, the Oriental and the Occidental. Two words, very often people make mistakes. Yeah. Yes, you are right, you are correct. Orient would refer to the East and Oriental would refer to the Eastern aspects, whereas the Occident would refer to the West. Okay, Orient, East. So here what we are trying to discuss is that in Said's book it was mentioned how the stereotype was created that the East, the Orient, or rather the colonized are the other, and this has helped to produce myths about the laziness, deceit and irrationality of Orients. Okay, that is also a kind of general ideology. By means of the discourse of Orientalism, Western cultural institutions are responsible for the creation of those others. So this is actually a creation by the Occidents. That is, the Westerners actually brought in this ideology that the colonizers are the powerful and the colonized or the Orientals are the other. There is this othering distinguishing that happened. Yes, a kind of inferior status maybe. Yeah, marginality. Yes. So the Orientals very different from the Occident helps establish that opposition by which Europe's own identity can be established. So this was a technique in a way through which they created their own identity. They also ascribed an identity to the colonized as the other. The knowledge of the Orient created by and embodied within the discourse of Orientalism serves to construct an image of the Orient and the Orientals as subservient and subject to domination by the Occident. Underline all these points. I know this must be a bit difficult for you, but once you understand the concepts, it's very easy. That is, they tried to create an image. Who tried to create an image? The colonizers tried to create an image. Image of whom? Image of the colonized. Okay. What kind of an image? That they are of inferior status and that they should be dominated. They are to be dominated by the colonized. Okay. Please make sure that you read about that. So the knowledge of the Orient is generated out of strength, and such strength generated knowledge in turn creates the Orient, the Oriental and the world as such. So this is an aspect interestingly discussed in Seth's Orientalism. Make sure that you study this. There would be even short questions. I have seen short questions. I'm not sure whether you are aware of this. We will discuss this towards the end of the session or as part of a separate session. That there could be short questions for 5 marks, and I have seen this question being asked repeatedly as part of that 5-mark short essay. So the Orient is contained and represented by dominating frameworks, and the encoding and comparison of the Orient with the West ensures that Oriental culture and perspectives are a deviation and a perversion that justify an inferior status for the colonized. Okay, inferior status, that is also mentioned. The Orient is seen essentially monolithic with an unchanging history. The history of the East was not given much prominence, while the Occident is dynamic with an active history. That is also important. They glorified their own history, whereas they didn't give much reverence to the East or the Orients and their history. Alright. Now moving on to Gayatri Chakravarti's Vivath.